interaction around what how that relates with your understanding. I certainly don't want to position myself as the expert, but I certainly, I guess I'm interested in how our different forms of training and our contexts may be related in this thing we call systemic leadership and systems leadership, which is written about increasingly over the last 10, 15 years. So, Mark, people are joining, so are you letting people in? I just want to check. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it keeps coming up. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start. I'm going to just find some slides to share with you, and that might help settle people as they're arriving, I think, and set the framework for what I understand by systems or systemic leadership. And hopefully that will give you a chance to think about how that relates with your practice and your stance. So I'm just going to ask you, Mark, when it comes up, to let me know, because it's waiting to upload. Does that come up? It's suddenly become very slow.
Not yet.
Can you see that? I can see it on mine, but maybe not.
Not seeing it here.
The joy of Teams. Maybe it's lunchtime bandwidth hour. Let's just give it 2 seconds.
It's on its way. Yes, it's a bit good. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I don't know. So it's now gone from me, Mark. Have you just done something?
No, I haven't touched anything.
Okay, fine. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so let me just go through this. Bear with me 1 second. Is that just changing, Mark? Can I just check with you? Okay. So I thought just to situate ourselves in relation to modern leadership approaches, I might just give a kind of a linear, just one framing of it, a linear approach to thinking about leadership thinking over the last century. Most of you, I realize there's a lot of experience, so please bear with me. It's just that it's difficult to know who's in the room and in this format, but I'm just going to give a very quick linear framework, really. So at the turn of the last century, you will know there was a shift with the industrialization of Taylorism, thinking about the organization in terms of productivity and efficiency and managing a workforce. And around the 30s, certainly right until the 50s probably, there was a great interest in trait theory, great man leadership, people being born to lead, and followership, the beginnings of that. Before the 1950s and 60s, there was increasing interest in studying leadership. Often, most of you will know, the studies were done on men in organizations, and so it is skewed in a sense, but the leadership styles became more vogue, and then there was work around situational leadership, contingency theories, more nuanced ways in the 70s. So then we had the oil crisis in the 70s, led to a radical rethinking in many ways about what leadership means and should be about, and that in some ways framed the approach to leadership for I guess a couple of decades even. Heroic leadership, visionary leaders had been the mainstay for many years, and that took us right, you might argue, up until the banking crisis. Along the way, there are others. I mean, this is just some very brief bullet points. Transformational leadership ideas and servant leadership became the talk until we got to roughly around 9/11, where once again the world order as we knew it radically changed in certainly many countries. And since the turn of this century, there's been increasing talk and thinking around complexity of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous worlds, wicked problems. And that's led to a series of models: agile leadership, authentic leadership, and then increasingly in the health and social care context in the last 10, 15 years, I guess, and more recently, talk of systems leadership. And I guess I just want to put that alongside a slightly different background, which is postmodern leadership approaches, which is where I would situate systemic leadership. And that's informed by the work around living systems from the 60s of Gregory Bateson. Some of you may know constructionism and constructivist ideas, an interest increasingly in group dynamics, cybernetics and complexity thinking, the Milan approach of hypothesizing and circularity, postmodern communication theories, dialogic versus diagnostic organizational development, distributed leadership. So these are some of the other approaches that have led to a postmodern stance towards leadership, which sits alongside, I guess, more traditional modern approaches of leadership. So, oh, I don't know if you can hear. So I'm just going to move on.
Is that the Health Foundation one?
I'm not sure, Mark, if you can silence, but bear with me, my slides are a bit slow. So what we're talking about, and I guess increasingly, is moving from our VUCA worlds and increasingly coming across in the literature around BANI worlds. I don't know how many of you use this, but VUCA has been talked about a lot. Increasingly, there's a sense of brittle, anxious, non-linear and incoherent worlds that we inhabit, and certainly Brexit and then COVID-19 has given us a real flavour for that. And that's where the postmodern approaches particularly lend themselves. I want to also talk about how I orientate myself in relation to the language, especially with what's written around systems leadership and what I understand and practice is systemic, because it helps me be curious if I'm reading something or talking to someone to explore what their understanding is and how that's informed. So again, bear with me if this is very old news to you. Just so we're all talking about the same thing here. First order systems thinking mainly, I guess, thinks of the system as an observed system. There is highly structural focus. People are looking at interconnections and networks, and there is an assumption that the system is often fully observable or discoverable. There is an interest, there's an acceptance that things are not linear often, and people are interested in feedback loops, and a lot of the systems leadership approach is about looking at relationships, connections, and dependencies. There is also still talk of the organization as a machine in some ways, with talk of the organization improving power and efficiency, including people like Peter Senge in the Fifth Discipline. Now, things have evolved, and there is other approaches to systems thinking, and so there's moving beyond structures and networks. There has been lots written about how, as leaders, we might attend to the environmental conditions in the system, the nutrients, what helps the system thrive. And the fish tank metaphor takes as one of those ideas, and that does help us get a sense of more biological, less structural systems. However, I guess the bit that the limitations of that are still the writing and the thinking is that we are the observers from outside, observing the system, seeing it as a whole, understanding it, diagnosing the problem, and attending to the environment. Whereas, I guess systemic thinking would locate us in the fish tank, very much one of the fish, contributing to the toxic environment, perhaps, or the patterns. So second order systems thinking takes account of that, recognizes that as observers, we are also part of a system ourselves, and the position and the relationship of the observer matters. It reminds, in a sense, us that if you can see it all, and if you can describe it in full, it ceases to be complex. So if I find myself trying to explain something in its entirety and thinking I've got it, I'm no longer dealing with the complexity. And it also recognizes that our observations are constructed, often co-constructed in relationship, and there is no real objective truth or knowing in a systemic leadership context. So it's inviting us to question our objective truths and knowing all the time as leaders, and bringing forth this idea that actually our systems are systems of continual sense-making and meaning-making. So they're going beyond physical structures and relationships. It's more about making sense of the situations we find ourselves. And that really informs the approach to leadership, which comes from the systemic practice. Some of you may be systemically trained, and you will know that systemic practice is really rooted in a number of disciplines: complexity thinking, dialogical approaches, sociology, cybernetics, postmodern communication theory, constructionism, anthropology, family therapy is, it's certainly in the health and social care context, a lot of systemically trained family therapists, psychologists, and philosophers. So it's a really rich landscape, and there is no single monolith, I guess, which is systemic leadership, but it allows us to be flexible and attend to emergent ideas. I do want to say that I don't think, the distinction between modern and postmodern, systemic and conventional can be complementary. I don't want to frame them as oppositional, and certainly it's useful to think about how one can then inform the other and help us as leaders in complex situations. So conventional leadership primarily still thinks of systems as machines. There's still talk in the NHS, if you think about it, as input and output, efficiency and power. Objectivity is still privileged. Functional hierarchies are everywhere. We talk about cause and effect, even though we theoretically know about complexity. There is a huge pressure and privilege, a lot of focus is put on analysis. We are still thinking about analysis as the highest form, breaking things down into these small, simple, identifiable causes and diagnosing the problem, and therefore diagnosing the right way forward. Contexts become fixed very easily in a conventional approach. People start looking, and teams start looking at issues through static lenses: money, efficiency, workload, time. Uncertainty and complexity can often be reduced by leaders. Sometimes people think of and talk about complex as difficult or somehow overwhelming or problematic. And the language, if you tune in, can be quite binary. People talk about good and bad, the cause, the problem, the right solution. And systems leadership, in my experience, certainly in the health and social care context, is often still looked at and enacted through the lens of relationships, networks, and scale. So when people talk about systems, they're often talking about scale. Whereas a systemic approach would really suggest that a systemic approach, you can enact it through a partnership of two people. It doesn't have to be in terms of scale. So that's one of the things that comes through in the literature a lot. So a systemic stance focuses on systems of knowing, sense-making, and meaning-making. It invites us to become really curious about reflexive patterns of communication between people and organizations and teams. It values intersubjectivity equally to objectivity. There's a sense that there's no objective knowing as a leader, and perhaps no objective observer. There's intersubjectivity that matters and is useful. We're invited to appreciate multiple stories and a multiverse rather than a universe. There is a focus on synthesis rather than analysis, so expanding and opening up ideas and building, generating new ways of thinking rather than analyzing them and breaking them down into cause, effect binaries. The idea that there's no instructive interaction, there is no given that, there's no linear x plus y equals z. Emergence is really harnessed as a resource for us. And the task of the systemic leader is partly to hold uncertainty and complexity, to provide a container for the system at times for complexity and use it as a resource. And if we're thinking systemically, we are really valuing the ethics of the process that we're engaged in, not really the content sometimes, but the process that we're involved in. What is the ethical stance as the leader in terms of the system? Positioning matters, and I think there is an interest in the interplay and the hierarchy, the order of the multiple changing contexts and meanings. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, a bit more about that. So where to start? I guess for me, primarily, you have to start with really embracing complexity and thinking about it as a resource. And I won't go into that today, given that I think there have been 2 sessions already around complexity and wicked problems. But really, as a systemic leader, complexity needs not to be theoretical. It needs to be lived and practiced as the way to approach everyday conversations and tasks. And then moving forward, I'm going to speak a little bit about system boundaries. So becoming interested in this concept of boundaries and our positions as leaders in relation to those boundary issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about context and meanings and something about narratives. So hopefully some of this stuff is familiar to you, and it's just a refresher. System boundaries and boundaries issues. What might we understand? So most of you will have come across the idea that the map is not the territory. So really helps us as systemic leaders to take a position and really get involved in the landscape, in the territory, and not be focused on the map, thinking about our positioning. I think of all boundary issues from a systemic stance as organizing principles or rules that define who's in and who's out, what's allowable and what's not. And then really often, in my experience, that is where power is negotiated, the edges of a boundary of a system, because those are the rules that connect us. And it helps us question simple notions or simplistic notions of physical, organizational and geographic boundaries, and instead become more curious and interested in contextual, relational, ideological, ethical, moral boundary issues which connect us as a group. So, for example, what's considered important or not by those in the system? Who has access to resources? Who's marginalized? Who benefits and who's disadvantaged? Whose voice is privileged? How do values get played out? These are some questions that sometimes help me, certainly, to think about what are the boundaries around this system that I'm part of? What am I noticing? Where am I positioned in relation to those issues? How are others positioned? And one of the tasks, I would argue, as a systemic leader is to become curious about boundary issues that define the system, and where useful, not always, to make them conscious. I guess there's something about choosing when you act on that and make it conscious and surface it. And then something about contexts, hierarchy of context. So at any one time, we are juggling multiple contextual levels, and these are some arbitrary ones, but we might be thinking about cultural context, what it means to be part of this culture, relationships, identity, our own sense of self and identity and role as a leader, the task or our task as leader, the meeting or the episode, the interaction or the communications that we're part of. These are just some contextual levels that we carry at any one time. And intrinsically, we always have a hierarchy and order in relation to any issue of what is most important for us. Sometimes our sense of identity and role as a leader is quite high up, and that then informs and shapes how we go about the task. Sometimes the relationship, in a sense, trumps our own sense of identity. So we are flexible, and we do this all the time. If you think about your relationships as leaders with other people, we're always negotiating context, and there are multiple meanings held by others and us in the system at all of those levels. And I guess one of the tasks of leadership, I'm just going to move this forward because it's stuck. Hold on. You know, it's a complex landscape. There are multiple contexts being juggled by everybody. There will be others to think about. And the question, I guess, is, as a systemic leader, how interested we are in the many levels at play and what are the meanings people hold. How can we become curious about our own hierarchy? How can we become interested in the hierarchy and meaning of others? And how do we decide whether we have to renegotiate our context with the other contexts, our meanings? And if there's a misalignment, should we make it explicit? Is that the way in? If we spot there is a misalignment, what do we do with it? These are some of the things that I certainly have at the back of my mind as I'm engaging with groups and a leadership task. What's their understanding? What's mine? What needs to be aligned? So there's this constant pressure as a systemic leader to be coherent and coordinate. Now, coherence, as I understand it, is the sense that when I go out and I act and do what I do, is it in line? To what extent am I in line with my values? And is it in line with the task at hand? Is it my approach aligned? And that, when things are aligned, we feel more, there's a sense of coherence about us as leaders. Coordination is about how the interplay between people. We are constantly coordinating and adjusting our approach, our context, our meanings, based on what we learn from others and how we position ourselves. So we're trying to do two things at any one time: bring a sense of coherence and coordinate usefully in the system. Not an easy thing. And then finally, narratives and storytelling. So storytelling, you will know, is fundamentally a social act. We create stories to help us make sense of the world. And these stories are around in our organizational life. They contain character and plot and emotion and meaning. And systemic leaders can consider the organization or the network primarily in terms of a communication and a storytelling system made up of constantly changing and emerging stories, with all the members in that system as individual storytellers. I mean, that is a framing that we can use to think about how to approach a system. Particularly powerful stories emerge all over the place, and often stories we tune into are about what is said and done. But if we're really interested, we can become curious about other stories. So there are often stories about belonging and relating in the system happening, stories of power and hierarchy, stories of emotions, anxiety, fear, threat, are particularly now stories of loss and grief, stories of jealousy and competition, stories around culture, and stories around identity. And as a leader, I guess we are situated in all of those stories. There are the stories being lived out around us. There are the stories being told, the ones we tell and the ones we live. And all around there are other stories you might be interested in. Untold stories. What are the unknown stories? The unheard stories. And there are always untellable stories, things that we just cannot tell. And this is happening in a sense much more fluidly all the time. And once again, as a leader, we're being invited to situate ourselves amongst all of these narratives. So a systemic stance would allow us to become curious and appreciate the many stories in the system. The aim is to be generative, not reductive, to generate hypotheses and meanings, to position ourselves within these stories and even momentarily bring about a sense of coherence. Change often is predicated on changing everyday conversations and meanings, if you think about it systemically. And one of our tasks might be to change the intersubjective realities, the cognitive maps in other language, which can then lead to different behaviors, and helping the system find a new and more useful story, an image or a constructed reality that affects behavior. So I'm going to just end by the last couple of slides, really. Often the kinds of things we might ask ourselves: which stories am I telling? Which ones am I aware of? And what am I not noticing? Which stories might I be privileging? How am I positioned in relation to my stories? Which ones are positioning me? Which stories am I inviting? Which ones am I creating? What might be getting in the way? Which are the stories that really get in the way of the collective task as we see it? And how might I be contributing to a pattern of stories which are not helpful? What are the unhelpful stories here that I might be allowing to continue? So recognizing our own involvement in this. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the themes around systemic leadership, but I really want to end with this idea that what does it involve? Well, I guess firstly, it's a collective endeavor, as I would see it. It's not a singular leader's approach. It's about collectively participating in systemic thinking and practice. Fundamentally, there is a requirement to observe and become deeply curious about ourselves, relationships, the context, the boundaries, the stories, and the patterns. I think if we're to be successful, we need to develop the art of neutrality and hypothesizing and rehypothesizing, holding judgments lightly, not to say we don't have judgments, but just constantly be rehypothesizing. What might be going on here? What's my hypothesis here? What do you think is the issue here? Let's come up with a new hypothesis. The skill, I guess, is a reflexive inquiry, and we could talk about that if that's useful, to surface, legitimate, learn from perspectives and narratives. So reflexivity becomes a skill that we need to harness and build. Attending to incoherences, tensions and paradoxes is, I think, fundamental as a leader in a complex system. Deciding when to surface them, deciding how to work with them, it becomes particularly useful for us. Helping sense making and meaning making, I've already mentioned. And in a sense, constantly being keen to perturb the system and notice what emerges around us. Not fixing on the long-term plan, but constantly looking at what is emerging and appreciating, even when we assume something is dysfunctional, there is a function of that behavior for the system. There is a reason why something is like it is, and really tuning in to the sensibility of the system. So I'm going to stop there, just mindful of the time, but I hope that has kind of given the beginnings of a stance and some curiosity that I want to share with you. So I'll just stop there. I'm sorry, I haven't seen the messages, Mark, but I hope that's
okay.
Is that okay?
It's absolutely fine. Thank you, Ali, for what I think is a really comprehensive and really provocative introduction to the topic. So I have just said to people, if there are comments or questions that come up off those introductory remarks, then please do use the chat box to start to share them, and we'll endeavour to weave them into the rest of the conversation. So a lot in there, and I've been scribbling away, so I've got a whole range of questions. I don't want to blindside you with questions. I do want to pick up, if I can, at some point, not immediately, but just your experience of working systemically, particularly in the course of COVID, which you mentioned. So I'm going to ask you to address that, but not immediately, because you may want to collect your thoughts in that respect. I was very taken by the fish tank. I like fish tanks for some peculiar reason. You see them in dental surgeries, and they're very relaxing. And the sight of the fish tank reminded me of the old joke where one goldfish is saying to two others, "How's the water today, guys?" And the other two goldfish says, "What's he mean water?" Because they haven't got that level of awareness. And so my first question for leaders, people that will be tuning in today, how does a leader experience their presence systemically when we're aware that when we're so immersed in that fish tank, it's sometimes difficult to get a perspective? So from your understanding and your practice, how do you get that systemic understanding as a leader?
Well, I guess that connects with one of the questions about reflexivity. And one of the things I often think about is the reflexivity muscle that we have as leaders. And how we might use kind of skilled inquiry to become curious about thoughts, emotions, actions, personally and others, and really thinking about what's going on. I mean, I think, as with all of this, the work that we do is starting with ourselves, noticing why we are, what we're feeling, the emotions, the thoughts and actions, but also becoming curious and noticing the responses. And so reflexivity, this concept of it's not the same as reflection retrospectively. It constantly being aware of how you are positioned, what's emerging in you internally, how you are choosing to respond, and then looking out for signs of anything that might give you a hint that there is a change around you, that something's landing differently, and becoming curious about this relationship, that the pattern you're creating, but at the same time questioning, what am I not noticing? Who else is here with me that can help me? Who can help me tell me what's behind? What is your experience like of this? So there's something about the collective sense making to build this richer picture of our combined situation is quite important for me. And so you finding spaces to access sense making, stopping, not just doing, is part of that sense of experiencing what's going on for me. I don't know if that answered your question, Mark, but that's where I would normally start, is really tune into, am I being reflexive enough? What does that mean in this context? What am I noticing? Who else can help me here? What are the patterns we're noticing? And why might that be? So hypothesizing then really helps us to go, well, what are the other things that might be causing this? What is the benefit to the system of this pattern? Even if I think it's not good, there must be a benefit. What is it? Let's think about it.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of something in the chat box, and to nudge you along from that, could you just say something, because I think the two terms get conflated quite a lot between reflective and reflexive, and reflexive sometimes just gets left there as if it was the same thing. So could you just talk a bit about what you're talking about when you say reflexivity and reflexivity?
Yeah, I guess I think they're both useful. They're both useful resources to us. Reflection, I guess I would see it more around thinking about what has just happened. So it's often a space to explain what's going on. When we're in this space of explanation, what has happened? We talk about sometimes reflection in action, which gets us closer to reflexivity. If you tune into what's going on, picking up what's going on, sometimes you're very close to reflexivity. But reflexivity is an internal process and an external action. So it's a constant iterative thing that happens, that you are really tuning into what's going on internally. How are you framing what's happening? Emotions, ideas, thoughts, actions, and then going, oh, okay, well, I'm just noticing that has had a different response to what I expected. I'm now going to change my hypothesis. I'm going to have to question my assumption here. What else might be going on? And that action, I think, gets us closer to what I understand as reflexivity.
I think that's really helpful, because I think it goes back to your point as well about the world not being observable, in the sense that we step back and look at it, and that's the case in so many settings, whether you're talking about research, particularly qualitative research, whether you're talking about systemic practice, and you're thinking about complexity. The capacity for a human being to abstract themselves and take themselves out of that context and not recognize the part they play as soon as they operate a presence, that for me is that kind of reflexive edge, which is to say, I cannot pretend to make a thing of the world that I can then hold up and look at. And there is a kind of hubris about a lot of leadership practice, that the world can be thingified, and then once you've got the thing, you can make stuff happen in it. And I think that's why, I constantly talk about reflexivity as a core component of leadership for this century and beyond, because it's central to that kind of thinking. Just in terms of terminology, somebody's picked up your use of the term synthesis, which is slightly Hegelian feel sometimes. Could you talk a bit more about what we're talking about around synthesis?
Well, I guess I can talk about it in relation to common practice, and I see it both in my clinical practice and educational practice. And we are very used to the so analysis. It would be what I would think is the opposite, or so analysis, looking at an event and breaking it down. That often, if you think about a significant event analysis, something's happened. Retrospectively, you go, what has happened? Let's break it down into these, cause-effect relationships, making it simple. There may be hundreds, and there may be 3 or 4 of little events. And then we identify at each step something that led to an event and therefore needs adjusting. So we make it simple. We could take a complex situation and we try to make it simple so that we can do something, and then we assume that change leads to a different outcome. And then we go around the cycle again. So often it's a reactive stance to something that's happened. Synthesis, I guess, invites us to be proactive as we are engaging in thinking about an issue, a dilemma or a problem, is to be making something not simpler, but probably more complex in a sense, by building in more perspectives, saying, what are the other dilemmas here? What are the other tensions? What are the possibilities for this? And actually not settling with 1 or 2 things that probably caused it, and sitting with that discomfort. Because that is where that edge of tension, that distress is often where new ideas emerge. You can get really creative engagement from people. And so you then start synthesizing new hypotheses about why else might this be happening. And then how do you test those? You can start testing those hypotheses. You make an intervention, and then you just see what happens. It's very difficult, I have to say, in the system that we are. I'm talking about the NHS, health and social care, where everything is driven to reducing anxiety, bringing us to certainty, to be sitting there saying, no, we won't do that. We won't do a SWOT and an SEA. I have this constant discussion. Because actually, often the question is, go right back to what are we trying to achieve here? Of course, if sometimes you have to retrospectively look at what has happened, but to assume there are linear cause-effect relationships in a simplistic fashion in a complex field of healthcare, social care, human systems, is fundamentally, I think, unhelpful for us. And so I'm talking about it in terms of all kinds of things. If you think about child safeguarding and child death, to all kinds of conditions, I really think and this is why it's a philosophical stance as well as a practical one, is to really stand and challenge that notion that analysis is the best way in a complex situation. Analysis is very useful in a complicated, if we think about the Cynefin stuff, or perhaps a simple issue. When things become complex in biological systems, analysis only gets us so far, so we need hypothesizing and synthesis. I don't know, does that give you a sense of what I mean?
Yeah,
Your question.
that's really good, because it's very comprehensive and it helps. It's a really useful framing for me to think about that, because for me, the tension very often in the context in which we work is the kind of constant hunt for data, but lack of perspective. So as if the data tells us something about the real world and we get lost in that simulacrum, and that's where the conversation takes place. Whereas the picture I was getting there as you talk was a kind of panoramic view that invites in alternative or subaltern views of the world that perhaps we wouldn't ordinarily entertain, but we genuinely need to try and take on board. So I was very impressed in terms of helping my thinking with that. Picking up on this, I guess, and this is always the $64,000 question in terms of discussions like this. There's something about the tensions that exist in the place in which we work as we try to think about working more systemically. So I'd made the note, something like where you'd said at one point, no objective knowing, and I think that's entirely appropriate and fully understandable, one to which I sort of would subscribe. And yet we work, as you intimated, and I think it's vitally important that we acknowledge this, we work in a context where certainty is privileged. We have to have certainty, stuff is fixable, this has to happen and that magic happens. So there's a conundrum at play there. And someone in the chat box has talked about, whether systemic practice is culturally feasible as we have these conversations. And I guess to build off the back of that, I was wondering about what as leaders do you think we have to unlearn about our understanding of the world before we can start to think genuinely systemically? So if you think about the system as a machine, Gareth Morgan is familiar to me. I know it's wrong. I know it's not a good way of seeing the world. And yet I still lapse back into it. And similarly with leadership, we're talking very articulately, I hope, about leadership in a different way. But so often we see old-fashioned heroic leadership in a whole range of contexts. So is it feasible? And if it's feasible, how do we unlearn staff to be able to embrace systemic thinking?
I think it is feasible. I guess coming up back to the culture, I'm immediately thinking, well, culture is co-created. If we take the notion of culture as co-created, socially constructed, and it's within everyday interactions and communications that we shape culture. We can shape culture in an organizational systemic context. Not overnight, but it is feasible to adapt it. So going back to, I guess I'm then thinking about the tensions and paradoxes that you're alluding to. I don't know whether unlearning is feasible, really. I guess assimilation is probably what I would kind of think about. How do we add to our models? And I agree, so Emma's point about there is a dominant culture, there's not one culture, but if we think back to where we were in the 50s, the culture around leadership has certainly changed. And in the last 10 years, 15 years, it's fundamentally changing. So unlearning is one thing. I think probably creating as leaders, I think not doing this in isolation, having networks and people and places where we are challenged, continually somebody's questioning us until we learn to question ourselves, to challenge the assumptions that underpin our endeavors, to challenge our mental maps, is the beginnings of thinking, well, what am I basing this on? Actually, fundamentally, if I'm thinking about if I slip into the system as a machine, power, focus, output, maybe I need to take a moment to rethink this. Now, I've often found myself in that situation where I feel like I grasp complexity, I like it, and then suddenly I find myself saying, well, we need to do it this way, X, Y, and Z. And I find myself using language and thinking that is fundamentally from a different stance. And in those moments, I think there are two things. I guess I have a choice. I can stop. I can check with somebody else to help me, because I might completely be lost. And that's sometimes being lost tells me something about the system I'm in. If I'm feeling a bit confused or unsettled, or if I think I really get it, often that's where the danger is. The minute I think, oh yeah, got it, this is what we need to do, I can see it clearly, I've had to learn that that is a dangerous point for me, because I'm then suddenly blinkered. So those are the moments I then go, actually, who can I access? Sometimes that is, our task is, so I'm thinking of some work where there's higher order NHS, or, quite powerful people saying, this is what we would like, can you work on this with this group? And actually the work is with the people above who are commissioning the pieces of work. Because no matter what we do with the group, fundamentally, if they're setting the output-input framework, it's going to be very incongruent with getting a group of leaders who have all kinds of tensions to deliver, because fundamentally, if they're being judged and paid and they have other tensions. So sometimes what helps is positioning ourselves in relation to what's being commissioned and who's commissioning, and helping the group sometimes to challenge that. So you can still have an intervention to challenge it.
Okay, thank you. There was a question earlier in the chat box around somebody talked about the vitality of storytelling and coherence, made a combination of the two items, and the correspondent said something along the lines of they'd seen clinical staff use storytelling really effectively and wondered whether that was something about clinical practice. They found it more difficult in a managerial context to do that in a way that felt authentic to them, I think is what I was saying. So do you have any observations around that, around storytelling, and whether there's a difference in terms of approach?
I have to say, I've worked with teams who, I think there's something about how you frame it for people to get into that space. But when people are in that space, actually storytelling can emerge. It's not I don't think it's connected to a role. I understand what I think they're saying is that in the clinical practice, it's been around a bit more. People are using it in lots of contexts, I guess. But I've certainly, when you work with individuals, and I'm doing some work around organizations in conflict who are really stuck, and when you sit with people and just try and use metaphor and talk about narrative and give them some examples, get them to imagine their team, and just visualize it. I mean, you might have to access other bits of the brain to visualize it. What are the words and phrases, what come to mind? How would you draw it? And then how would you describe that? Immediately people tap into quite powerful stories. And often within that, you realize they are holding some stories around leadership, the leaders. So you sometimes have to access it and frame it in a different way, but I think it can be done. And it can be quite powerful to do, actually. But it does need a bit of, you might need to add to it. There's a bit of modeling. And I've often had to then talk about, for example, in my partnership, some of the stories that we held, and frame that for people. So if it's new territory, it does need a bit of modeling, I think, certainly in my practice. But I've worked with managers who really, once they get it, incredible, very clear. The clarity comes right through. If people get it, they can really tap into their own stories about who they are as a leader, what leadership means. It's not so straightforward, I accept. And I think one of the things, I'm working with a group of managers at the moment, who are so entrenched in a managerialism way of doing that almost they look at stories as waffle, and that's the challenge. They kind of go, well, I've done a master's in this and I do that. What's this about? And that's a communication act to me, which I then need to attend to. So what they're questioning something else, I think, probably. And so I think instead of pushing with the stories, I'm then having to think about, well, what does this doubt mean for us here? What is it telling me? Let's work on that instead of pushing with a story. Does that?
Yeah, it does.
Thank you.
With time pressing on, so we've got about 8 minutes before we finish. I was going to go back to the question I was threatening you with at the start, which was, no, it's fine. So I'm certainly not one of those people that thinks we can draw instant conclusions from the experiences we've had from the past 12 months, because that's not how life works. So there's not a fix. If you looked at some of the thought leadership in the world, you'd think it was all done and dusted, and COVID-19 was fully understood organizationally and practically, and it's just a tick box exercise to get yourself back on track. But I did wonder, just in terms of sense making through a systemic prism, what observations you might have had in terms of your work and practice over the 12 months of the pandemic. Because there's stuff around, we've talked about hierarchy and the way in which hierarchy works, and there are clearly instances across that history where hierarchy collapsed or fell away or just flexed to allow stuff to happen. Similarly with boundaries, which you brought up, boundaries that were fierce and quite controlling seem to disappear, and yet, of course, they are reappearing. So I just wondered if you had any observations from a systemic perspective about the work you have been doing over the past 12 months with organizations and with people, and what that might tell us in practice about trying to work systemically.
Oh gosh, okay, so I guess just taking a snap, standing back and taking a very brief overview, I guess what fundamentally the COVID did was it set a new context for us nationally and internationally, first of all, which then informed the organizational and the working practice. So I guess something about the context shifted because there's a wider context change. So, and that I think certainly society, there was at the beginning, the leadership approach was, I'm not going to go into the politics of it, but in the very beginning, once someone realized that we need to do something because we were bordering on chaos. Then there was a period where it felt appropriate and proportionate to an extent for those first, and people were, in a sense that people organizationally and society were on board enough. But what that also allowed is people to foreground in the organizations, I thought, as a different way of being, allowing a different way of being to emerge. And suddenly that sense that there was a sense of care. We talk about care all the time, don't we, in healthcare, social care. But actually often our practices aren't caring the way we are engaging, and we are not cared for. What I think the shift in the national context, the anxiety, the fear, the uncertainty allowed care, I think, to be foregrounded so that people could, in a sense, leaders could then say, no, we won't do this, and I'm privileging care, compassion for now. And I think it represents for me a classic kind of complexity. There was no long-term plan. It was really test something out, do something, coordinate, get together, make sense of something, do something, and we see where we are, and let's see. And nobody was thinking about a long-term plan. Everybody just thought, let's just see how this is for now, and let's reevaluate. So I guess I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I think if I think about the organizational work, everybody, it struck me in those first few months, was trying to make sense of something they hadn't ever thought about. And that allowed them to foreground emotion, fear, anxiety, vulnerability. And leaders were allowed that position leaders, I think, in a different way, because they were hearing it differently. They were sharing it. So there was suddenly a new system of sharing vulnerability that allowed people to act differently. And what's happening is, as now we're going back into an old way, perhaps a different way of working, people are feeling maybe less anxious. Leaders are going back to what's my task. And there's an opportunity here, I think. Really is an opportunity here for people not to go into old ways of doing things and to radically question the old roles and responsibilities and expectations. Because I think there's a distancing now about that vulnerability coming through a bit more as I'm seeing it. People are kind of going back into, let's pick up these things. And I don't think we can. I think we really need to reconstruct a new way of doing it, and learn from what really worked, really going back to what really helped us in those first 6 months. What can we take from that? How can we do more of this? How can we say no to this? It did work. So I hope I really do hope it's one of those classic examples that something's emerged. We've made sense of it. Mostly it's worked. It has helped us to an extent in an organizational context. It's got rid of the bureaucracy. It allowed people to get on with the task. And there is an opportunity here to work from there rather than go back.
Thank you. Ali, thank you very much for an excellent hour. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, but I know that I have to go back to the recording because I want to listen to it again, because it's just been such a rich experience, and I'm convinced, in terms of juggling what I was trying to do, I've missed lots of vitally important stuff. So thank you again for spending an hour with us and sharing your observations, your thinking, and your knowledge, which has been invaluable.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to everyone who has joined us. I hope it's been a good use of an hour of your time, and I hope you've got something to take away from it that will be useful as you go back into systems and complex organizations. And thank you all again for taking time to spend some time with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you all.